Hey everyone, welcome to part one of the Civil War. Our questions to think about here: what was President Lincoln's perspective on the secession of the southern states, and how did the secession debate affect the border states? So beginning with the inauguration of President Lincoln in March of 1861, Abraham Lincoln had repeated his pledge, quote, not to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. But the immediate question, of course, was the issue of secession. During his speech, President Lincoln emphasized the view that, quote, the union of these states is perpetual and therefore no state can lawfully get out of the union. The concept seems really simple, but it's going to determine Lincoln's attitude and strategy throughout the war. It's also going to determine on what grounds the peace is going to be concluded. Now, we've talked about this quite a bit already, but many of the southern states are going to argue that the Civil War was fought on behalf of the states' rights rather than slavery. In other words, that this wasn't really about slavery. The Southerners are going to argue this has everything to do with the compact theory of government and the power of the states versus the power of the national government. But the problem is that if the southern states had really fought the Civil War because of states' rights or the compact theory, then the issue would have exploded much earlier during the nullification crisis. But as we saw, no other states joined South Carolina in the protest against the federal government. And it's not until 1861 that the passionate desire to preserve the institution of slavery that actually led the southern states to secede from the Union and to make these constitutional arguments. So to go back to something that John Green said before, is a state's right to what? And the answer is a state's right to continue the institution of slavery. When we take a look at the secession of the Upper South, or sometimes called the Border South, before the Battle of Fort Sumter, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina had all seceded from the Union and formed what they considered to be an independent nation, the Confederate States of America. But in the immediate aftermath of Fort Sumter, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina all voted to secede as well. But the problem comes in the mountainous region of Virginia, roughly 48 counties in northwestern Virginia. This is an area where slavery is not terribly important to the economy. Obviously, as part of the state of Virginia, slavery is legal, but when the decision was made for Virginia to secede from the Union, the people living in the mountainous areas voted not to go along with that. And so in 1861, we see the creation of West Virginia, and in 1863, West Virginia became a state. For the rest of the states where slavery was legal, we have Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Delaware really didn't have much of a debate about whether or not to leave the Union. So even though slavery is legal in Delaware, there was really no consideration of secession. But the story is a little different in Maryland. As one of the other border states, Maryland is having a struggle with whether or not to secede from the Union. And of course, the problem is that if Maryland secedes from the Union, then Washington, D.C. would be trapped within the Confederacy since Virginia has already seceded. And so the other thing that's going on here in Maryland is that there is a very strong pro-Confederate sentiment in the state of Maryland. And so in order to shut down that disloyalty, President Lincoln is going to take a controversial step of questionable legality, and that is he is going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus requires that a person be brought before a judge. So if you are arrested, you have to be told why you've been arrested or what crime you're being charged with. As part of the Constitution, this is a requirement. But with Article 1, Section 9, the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in cases of rebellion or invasion. But you'll notice it's in Article 1, which deals with Congress, not the president. So technically, President Lincoln doesn't have the power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, but Congress is going to fix that problem with the Habeas Corpus Act of 1863, which gives the president that authority to suspend the writ. The other thing I want to mention here briefly as kind of an aside is this issue of rebellion. At no point does President Lincoln ask Congress to declare war on the Confederate States of America, because by doing so, you're effectively saying that the Confederate States of America legally exist and we are going to declare war on them. Instead, President Lincoln is very deliberately and very carefully referring to this as a rebellion, that this is a case where the Southern people are rebelling against the authority of the United States government, and not a situation where the Southern states have seceded. Because in Lincoln's view, secession is not legal. When the states ratified the Constitution, they have created something different than what we saw with the situation of the Articles of Confederation. And that's why we've spent so much time this semester talking about the compact theory of government. Kentucky is another one of the border states where there is a very strong pro-Confederacy element. But when the Civil War breaks out, one of the first major troop movements of the United States Army is to move troops from Ohio into Kentucky. And that effectively squashes the ability of Kentucky to secede from the Union. Missouri is an interesting case. I've described it here as the Civil War writ small. And what that simply means is all of the complexities of the Civil War, this struggle where, within families, brothers are choosing different sides to support. And it's not an easy or an automatic decision of whether or not to join the Union or to join the Confederacy or the rebellion. So Missouri, we have a situation where there is a very strong pro-Confederate element. In fact, the governor of Missouri supports secession, and he actually organizes a pro-Confederate secessionist militia to help the Confederate Army. But the other thing going on in Missouri is that we have a very large German immigrant population, and they almost completely oppose the institution of slavery and secession. In fact, when news that the Civil War broke out finally reaches Missouri, 4,200 men immediately joined the Union Army to support the United States government. 4,100 of those men were of German descent. So within this very large population, there is strong pro-union support. So coming back to our questions to think about, what was President Lincoln's perspective on secession of the Southern states? He firmly believes that the compact theory of government is invalid. And keep in mind that this was something that South Carolina and the other states were using to justify secession, that they had joined the Union of their own free will and that they could leave it when they wanted. Lincoln basically says that's untrue. He says that when the states ratified the Constitution, they created something different. I've described it before as like a chemical reaction. Once you've ratified the Constitution, you can't go back to that earlier state of the Articles of Confederation. So Lincoln believes that secession is not legal and that the Southern states have not left the Union, but rather the people of the Southern states are rebelling against the authority of the United States government. And then the second question, how did the secession debate affect the border states? It's a struggle. I mean, this is not an easy or an automatic decision. Delaware remains in the Union wholeheartedly. Maryland struggles. There's a strong pro-Confederate element in Maryland. But ultimately, with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, Abraham Lincoln is allowed to authorize the arrest of many of those pro-Confederates. They're thrown in jail and they sit there where they can't stir up that pro-Confederate sentiment. Kentucky is strongly pro-Confederate, but the movement of the Union Army prevents their secession. And in Missouri, despite a very strong pro-Confederate element led by the governor, Missouri stays within the Union. So stay tuned for part 2 of the Civil War.